Johnson is elected as
On
the
today's
leader of
World
the
Insight
Conservative
with
and
Tian Wei, Boris Johnson, the next British Prime Minister.
Huge. We are going to energise the country. We're going to get Brexit done.
Can he deliver Brexit by the end of October? And
U.S. economic terrorism, so
worsening tensions in the Gulf over seized oil tankers. What can help de-escalate the situation? Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight live from Beijing. We begin our show in London, where Boris Johnson has been declared Britain's next Prime Minister. He got the job through a Conservative Party vote. Mr. Johnson takes over from Theresa May, who resigned after failing to get her Brexit deal through Parliament. The new Conservative leader campaigned for Brexit, and now it's his turn to try and take Britain out of the European Union.
that Boris Johnson is elected as the leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party.
Boris Johnson defeated Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt overwhelmingly in a vote of Conservative members. He will officially take office as Prime Minister Theresa May steps down on Wednesday.
And we know the mantra of the campaign that has just gone by. In case you've forgotten it, you probably have. So it is deliver Brexit, unite the country and defeat Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Johnson started his career as a journalist and was fired from his first job for making up a quote. He reported on the European Union from Brussels and was caught exaggerating and in some cases simply inventing stories. After moving into politics, Boris Johnson became London mayor by winning over voters who didn't ordinarily vote for the Conservatives. During his time as mayor, London hosted the Olympics and the city started a popular bicycle hire scheme, though both had been signed off before he took office.
He is hugely intelligent, enormously charismatic, quite offbeat. He breaks the rules, he does the kind of things that people don't expect politicians, or certainly didn't in the old days, to do. He speaks what's on his mind.
Mr. Johnson's biggest task as Prime Minister will be to take his country out of the EU. Failure to deliver Brexit could add its name to the list of Conservative leaders who've been brought down by party divisions over Europe.
Incoming Prime Minister Boris Johnson, what is he likely to do about Brexit and the UK's future? With us, Ian Beck, a research fellow at the European Institute of the London School of Economics and Political Science. In Brussels, we invited Fraser Cameron, a senior advisor at the European Policy Center in Brussels. In Beijing, Cui Hongjian, senior fellow director of the European Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Professor Beck, of course, I go to you first. As someone coming from the UK, there's nothing surprising today, the result, but the question really is, how is Mr. Johnson likely to deliver his two promises, Brexit and unite the country?
With extreme difficulty, because he's made promises to one group which are completely incompatible with promises he's made to another group. He has said to the business and pro-Remain members of his party that he will ensure that there is a strong trading relationship with the EU, and he said to the hard Brexiteers that he is going to leave with no deal if need be, because he's going to stand up to these beastly Europeans and make sure that the British voice is heard. And you cannot deliver both of those. The same thing with Northern Ireland, where he says that he is going to undo the backstop, which is in the withdrawal arrangement between the EU and the UK, and at the same time he's going to preserve the border, the lack of a border in Northern Ireland. Again, you cannot have all these things simultaneously.
Right.
So the biggest challenge will be reconciling the irreconcilable.
Interesting. Mr. Cameron, would you agree with your colleague coming from the UK? What does it mean for the European Union? Mr. Johnson finally in his office.
Well, nothing fundamentally has changed except the occupant of number 10 Downing Street. The EU 27 member states made an agreement with the UK last year
The British Parliament so far has failed to ratify that agreement. Mr Johnson has come in saying he will now try and get changes to the agreement, and there will be no changes to the agreement. So ultimately he's going to have to either accept the deal or say, look, I've managed to get some added bonus points about the future in the new declaration and try and sell that to the House of Commons and his own party. But fundamentally, nothing really has changed.
But you know, it's October the 31st. That's what he said. October the 31st. The Brexit deal has to be done. Now, I'm not very good with math, but I do know it's a very short period of time, Mr. Cameron. Done or not likely so?
It's almost impossible to do it by 31st October, even if you went for the no deal, to get the necessary legislation through the British Parliament, which is now going on holiday tomorrow for about 6 weeks' time, and then there are party conferences. There are literally only 3 or 4 weeks of parliamentary time. So the timetable that he has put forward is really impossible to realize.
Well, Professor Begg, you know, during the speech given by Mr. Johnson, now the Prime Minister, he said, dude, let's get it done. With these kind of words, will he be able to rally the crowd and rally the morale for Brexit, Professor?
Well, he's certainly going to try. Normally when a new Prime Minister comes into office, that person, even if they've only come in through a party appointment rather than through a general election, comes in with the goodwill of the population, the goodwill of his colleagues, and the expectation that he be given or she be given some time to try to change things. I think he has no time. As Fraser just said, the timetable is very short because of the parliamentary break that's about to occur. There's a huge amount to be done. And there isn't the momentum or the goodwill behind Boris Johnson that there might have been with somebody who was elected by a full vote of the population. He is going to struggle enormously to make progress.
But does it really matter, Mr. Cui? I mean, coming from a third party studying the situation, he is a great friend, according to President Donald Trump, of the United States, and therefore will things be easier? Will the Washington coming up and fight for Downing Street number 10 against the European Union? What is likely to be the rule of the game from now on?
Indeed, I think it will be in the expectation that Johnson will take the position as the Prime Minister.
Yeah.
But now I agree with our two guests. Now he's facing a very, very big challenge.
Yeah. What about the relation with the United States?
With the United States, yes, I think it would be another very, very big uncertain factor. As we understand that Mr. Trump praised Johnson and to support so-called Brexit, and I think it will give some more pressure on the British government. But of course, I think Mr. Johnson is as smart as possible. He tried to keep a distance with Mr. Trump.
Okay.
But of course, I think now the big issue for United States and the UK is how could Mr. Johnson to get some benefits or some promise from Mr. Trump about this proposed FTA between the UK and the US.
Is it possible, Professor Begg?
Well, yes. Trump keeps telling us we can have a trade deal in about 20 minutes because he will say, right.
Well, if you look at what this trade deal between China and the United States has been taking, maybe it's a little bit too optimistic, sir.
Exactly. And I think that if Trump offers a very good trade deal, it will be a very good trade deal for America, not for the UK. So we have to beware of this idea that something dramatic will come from Washington to shore up Boris Johnson's position.
Professor, what is a good deal for the UK if you say it may not be a good deal for the UK? What is a good deal?
Well, a good deal would be one which gave reasonably equal weight to British and American preferences in what was conceded. For example, there are very difficult issues around allowing American healthcare providers to enter the UK market. Nearly everybody in Britain regards our National Health Service as something that no other country is allowed to touch. Trump will be pushing for that to be included in a trade deal. The British side would resist it. And if that happens, then you're in a deadlock.
Mr. Cameron, and therefore, what does it mean? Well, the two already having very similar hairstyle are also trying to say politically they're each other's friends. So what does it mean for Brussels?
Well, I mean, just to reinforce what Ian Begg said, there's a zero chance of any quick trade deal between Britain and the United States, because although Trump might be personally quite keen on Boris Johnson, the fact is it would be the American Congress that would have to ratify a deal, and they've made it very clear that if there's any changes to the status quo in Northern Ireland, there will be no trade deal with the United Kingdom. As far as Brussels is concerned, they're simply watching this with some bemusement, because here, at the beginning of the campaign, both Theresa May and Liam Fox said, oh yes, we'll easily have 40 trade deals in the next couple of years. In fact, they've got hardly any trade deals. They can't even get the Canadians, a close friend of Britain, to roll over the existing agreement they have with the EU. So normally trade deals take years and years to negotiate. There's no quick fixes for this for the UK.
Professor Begg, our Brussels friends are laughing on the sideline of what's going on in the promises made by the earlier politicians. Now, will they continue to have the pleasure to do so for the next few months and probably a few years into the term of Mr. Johnson?
I don't think they're laughing. They're concerned, because if there is the extreme case of a no deal, which I still consider unlikely, it's damaging to both sides. And Michel Barnier, the EU's Brexit negotiator, very recently said, Brexit is lose-lose, whatever the deal is, because both sides are going to lose something from it. And it's only a question of how big the loss is. I think that nobody's laughing in Brussels. As Fraser Cameron said, they're looking at as with bemusement. They cannot understand how an advanced, normally stable political system like the UK has been able to get itself into such a mess. But they hope they can extricate something sensible from it, so they'll be very concerned about these threats coming from Boris Johnson of no deal if it has to be no deal.
But, you know, Professor Begg, at the very beginning, even though you mentioned about the paradox that Mr. Johnson as the Prime Minister has to operate in, given the fact that he's pro-Brexit, on the other hand, there's such a division in the country about Brexit issue still, it is very interesting as to how will he be able to rally the country. If not, what does it mean? Is he going to be only a transitional leader as Miss Theresa May was?
Well, but there's one scenario in which his transition is extremely short indeed, because it's just possible that the House of Commons will propose a motion of no confidence in Boris Johnson, and he should be very alarmed by the fact that several senior ministers over the last couple of days have announced their immediate resignation, because they then want to go on what we call the back benches to be ordinary members of Parliament, and they're going to start a campaign to unseat Boris Johnson quite soon. His only saving grace is that the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn is an even greater mess than the Conservative Party, and not therefore an effective opposition.
But Mr. Cui, when you are listening to this, do you think Mr. Johnson, with years of political experience and personality shining, getting all the attention and drama in the public media, even though he was a member of the media team earlier, decades ago, when he was just starting his professional career, will be able to fade away, or actually this is going to be the way of UK politics from now on?
I think now we need to understand what happened now in a British society, and especially...
So what's your understanding?
I understand is now maybe the UK, the British people and the Conservative Party, they need a kind of a very special or specific politician to be a leader, because we can find out a similarity between you know, the British politics and also now American politics. Just like what happened, I understand that some people comparing, you know, Johnson with Mr. Trump. Even they are different, right. But on the appearance, especially on the feeling from average people, from the, you know, the parties, I think they are same, because they need something. They need some new people. Yeah. They are different from Theresa May, from Mr. Cameron.
Yes, but style is one thing, Mr. Cameron. This Cameron, of course, is coming from the European Policy Center. But whether he or she can get things done is another issue. And now, once elected into the office, it's not the style that really counts, but also what you do really counts. So will Mr. Johnson be a transitional figure or likely to be one that's likely to define the way of UK politics?
I personally think Johnson is totally unfit to hold this office, and nearly everybody who has worked with Johnson...
But he is in the office, sir. May I remind you about that fact, whether you like it or not, sir?
Yeah, but you just asked me if he can be there for some time, and I don't think he can, because he's not a man for detail. He's not a man who has proved himself in any high office. He was a total disaster when he was Foreign Secretary. And as Professor Begg said, he has many, many enemies, even within his own party. So the chances of him surviving just 6 months in office are no more than 50-50.
Now, Professor Begg, whether he will remain in the office also has a lot to do with what kind of administration he's likely to establish. Now, we understand there are certain names being mentioned during the campaign, but what do you think will capable people likely to work with him? As we know, when the politics are really running high, people are trying to make their choices whether they work for one administration or not at all.
Well, I think he's going to recruit reasonably high-quality ministers for the most significant ministries in the government. But Boris's trick when he was the Mayor of London was that he appointed very high-caliber officials behind the scenes. And the person who's been suggested as his future Chief of Staff is somebody who is very highly regarded. And that's the sort of person that can make the difference between a successful Johnson administration and a complete failure, if he listens to them. But as Fraser Cameron said to you, Boris Johnson is somebody notoriously incapable of concentrating on the detail, and a Prime Minister is somebody who has to understand detail, who has to be on top of very complex and diverse dossiers at the same time. And if he shows the kind of cavalier attitude he's shown in previous roles, where he doesn't know about this, he doesn't know about that, and makes up his response without thinking it through, that is disastrous for a Prime Minister. It's not something a Prime Minister can get away with.
Professor Begg, though you might want to look at other examples around the world now, I don't want to mention specific names, but there are politicians like that existing in our world. It's very interesting what you have just said. Having said that, though, let me move on to another important question. That is, what's likely to be the international approach by the Johnson administration? If you think about the UK, it's still a member of the United Nations Permanent Five. It is going to play an important role still on international multilateral mechanisms like the WTO, like the World Bank, like the IMF, and some of the others. So, Professor Begg, what's likely, from your perspective, the role of the UK on international policies that are important, including what's going on right now with Iran?
Well, I think that in the first instance, we should recognize that Boris Johnson at core is somebody who's in favor of a liberal international trading order of the multilateral institutions. And it's really only around Brexit that he departs from the mainstream of the political tradition in the UK. He is not right-wing in the conventional sense, even though many of us tend to associate pro-Brexit as being pro-right-wing. I think he's more a liberal social reformer, and he would want to be internationalist in his approach. So I would say that in that instance, it's the British civil service which will have the dominant role in deciding UK international policy, with one exception, and that's Trump. Brexit has brought Trump close to Boris Johnson, and he will want to ensure that he has a strong relationship with Trump as someone who he thinks can provide good deals for Britain in the future. That is the unknown bit of this story.
Mr. Cameron, of course, I'm sure Brussels have already studied Mr. Johnson very closely over the years. What's likely to be his regional and international approach besides Brexit issue?
Well, he's going to, unfortunately, face the inescapable facts of geography. Britain is a medium-sized power on the European continent and has to work with its allies in Europe. I mean, look at the example of Iran today. There's the Foreign Secretary yesterday calling for a European force to patrol ships going through the Gulf of Hormuz, when the United States point blankly said, no, we are not going to help you there. So Britain is in this dilemma. On the one hand, they want to be close to the United States, although I must say that Trump is very unpopular in Britain, and that will not go down too well with the voters. On the other hand, the inescapable fact is that Britain needs European allies to deal with most of the problems it faces.
Mr. Cui, of course, when I ask you as a Chinese analyst, it might be about China-UK relations. It's still early, I understand that, when administration comes into being, and China policy may not be the priority, particularly for the UK right now. But if you think about that, there were the so-called golden years, even though it didn't last long during the last Cameron administration. So what do you make of the potential, given UK's choices or number of choices for the near future?
I think firstly, China will keep a very close concern about the final outcome of the Brexit, because it will be decisive for China to make it clear which kind of policy towards the European Union and also UK. But of course, I think China also takes the importance of this consistency of the called the golden era, and proposed by President Xi and also the Prime Minister Cameron. But of course now I think that China will also take care of the any kind of risks it will be taken by the British government, especially in the wake of the Brexit, because we know now leaving from European Union means that there will be a smaller, influence for the UK, and of course at the same time the UK try to keep its so-called global power. So it will give some more, maybe space for the leaders and also for some sectors in UK to do something to be part of the leadership of world.
I see.
It will give some more opportunity.
Okay, Professor Begg, your final comment before we go.
Well, you may remember a few years ago there was somebody who was a US vice presidential candidate called Dan Quayle, who tried to compare himself to JFK. And Lloyd Benson, his opponent, said, gave the political insult, "Senator, I knew Jack Kennedy, you know Jack Kennedy." Boris Johnson likes to compare himself with Churchill, and I think the answer to that is, Boris, you know Winston Churchill.
Well, shall I say it's quite amusing when you are wrapping up the discussion with this quote. And as final thought as well, for now, I want to thank the three of you, gentlemen, for helping us understand better about what to come. Cui Hongjian, Ian Begg, Fraser Cameron, really appreciate it. Thank you, gentlemen. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, still to come on our live program. Worsening tensions in the Gulf over seized oil tankers. What can help de-escalate the situation? Issues about Iran and more. We'll ask our panelists right after this break. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Tian Wei. Let's turn to the brewing tensions in the Gulf. Iran has seized a British oil tanker, while there is an Iranian tanker detained by the UK. Meanwhile, under the pressure of economic sanctions and increasing military presence of the US, Tehran announced it had broken up an alleged CIA spy ring. Before we get down to a discussion about the latest related to the Iran issue, take a look at this first.
A series of incidents in the Gulf, with relations between Iran and the UK quickly deteriorating. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard seized the British-flagged Stena Impero oil tanker in the Strait of Hormuz last Friday. Iran released footage showing part of the 23-man crew it's currently detaining, along with the tanker, in the port of Bandar Abbas. The UK described it as a hostile act, while Tehran said it detained the vessel after it broke international maritime rules and collided with a fishing boat.
Iran does not seek confrontation. Iran wants to have normal relations based on mutual respect. But international agreements must be implemented multilaterally, not unilaterally.
The seizure came just 2 weeks after Britain seized an Iranian tanker off the coast of Gibraltar, suspecting it of carrying oil to Syria, which is in violation of EU sanctions. On Monday, Britain's outgoing Prime Minister Theresa May chaired an emergency response committee meeting to discuss the crisis. Her government urged Iran to immediately release the crew.
If Iran continues on this dangerous path, they must accept the price will be a larger Western military presence in the waters along their coastline, not because we wish to increase tensions, but simply because freedom of navigation is a principle which Britain and its allies will always defend.
Meanwhile, Iran and the U.S. are also at odds. 17 Iranians were reportedly arrested and charged, suspecting them of being part of a CIA-recruited spy network. But Washington has denied any involvement. Tehran said the U.S. was lying, rejecting a U.S. claim last week that it brought down an Iranian drone. Tensions in the Gulf have come to a head since the Trump administration announced the U.S. withdrawal from the 2015 nuclear deal. Iran has been facing heavy economic sanctions, while the U.S. raised its military presence in the region. In the past few months, several oil tankers in the Gulf have been attacked. Could things get worse?
Could things get worse? That's the ultimate question, isn't it? Will Gulf tensions come to a head with warships in the region? Let's loop in our panelists. With us, Tehran, Iran. Mohammad Marandi, Professor, Dean of the World Faculty Studies, University of Tehran. In London, once again, Ian Begg, Professorial Research Fellow at the European Institute of London School of Economics and Political Science. Last but not least, in Fort Lauderdale in the U.S., Ivan Eland, Senior Fellow and Director of the Center on Peace and Liberty at the Independent Institute. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. I did notice in the background we didn't have a quote from Iran, so very important. Let's have the Iranian voice being heard. Professor Marandi, what do you think is the account or recount of the Iranian side? What exactly happened? Let's hear your perspective. If you can, within 1 minute, sir. Professor Marandi.
Well, this whole escalation began with the U.S. leaving the nuclear deal and imposing its will on other countries, bullying other countries not to abide by the nuclear deal. So the EU is, as we speak, in complete violation of the nuclear deal. Over the last year, the Iranians have fulfilled their side of the bargain. They were in full compliance, but the Americans and the Europeans, as I said, were not. So I think the Iranians have felt that they've shown the international community that it is Iran that is seeking to keep the peace. It's the Americans who are seeking escalation, and it's the Europeans who, despite nice words, but they have been abiding by Trump's demands. And with regards to recent events, the United States has sent a drone over Iranian airspace. The Iranians had to shoot it down. They captured the remnants of the drone inside Iranian territorial waters. And then the British, at the bidding of the United States, according to the Spanish foreign minister, took an Iranian supertanker illegally because Iran is not a part of the EU sanctions regime. The EU sanctions regime has to do with EU countries, and the Iranians believe that the United States took this tanker as a part of their economic war against Iran.
And now we have a lot of stories going on all at the same time. Mr. Eland, coming from the U.S., just to be fair, your thought about this, particularly likely to be an escalating of tension, even leading to certain kinds of conflict, or not so?
Well, I would agree with much of what was said. However, I think it's wrong to say that the U.S. is unified in seeking escalation. I actually think that the Iranian foreign minister was right the other day when he was interviewed by Fareed Zakaria, who's a U.S. correspondent for CNN, when he said he doesn't think he takes Trump at his word that he doesn't want war, but he's not so sure about his advisors. And I would agree with that. I think we're in a dangerous situation because even if the heads of the countries don't want to escalate, sometimes the lower levels can either have a provocation which is unauthorized, or there can be an accidental or a misunderstanding, and that's when it can escalate. And I think that's the real danger here.
Professor Begg, of course, the UK is involved. Some even say there's some kind of proxy interaction between Washington and Tehran going on in a way through the UK's actions and words. What do you make of the UK's role now? What kind of role will it play?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that the UK has found itself caught in the middle of this, because it's true, if we read the reports, that US intelligence had pinpointed the ship held in Gibraltar, the Grace 2, as being headed for Syria, and that then meant that it was in danger of breaching EU sanctions on Syria, which was not to shore up the Assad regime. So this being caught in the middle has been part of the British difficulty in this. The Iranians immediately said that they would reserve the right to retaliate, and quite clearly what's happened in the last week has been a form of retaliation, where the seizure of the Stena Empora is a quid pro quo or tit for tat for what happened to the Grace in Gibraltar. Now, the UK is in this weak position where it's only got one ship in the area. That ship was on other duties and wasn't able to come to the rescue of the one that was taken by the Iranians. So it's an impossible dilemma for the Brits at the moment.
Well, Professor Morandi, let me just be a third party here in suggesting that everybody has their account of the stories itself. So let's put aside what exactly is the account of the stories, because we can go on for days and months until the conflicts are resolved. But let's focus on even bigger issues, strategic issues. Now, the Strait of Hormuz is a very important place for the rest of the world. If tensions are still rising, whichever party is playing a bigger hand in this, will be a disaster for the rest of the world. Now, Professor, from the Iranian perspective, how are you going to make sure that this will not become a retaliation against all the other parties which are not involved in this?
Well, that's a very good point. The Iranians do want shipping to pass through the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf without any difficulty, because first and foremost, Iran is very much dependent on shipping in the Persian Gulf region. So Iran's interests lie at the heart of the stability of the Persian Gulf region. And until the United States began this escalation, shipping in the Persian Gulf region was normal. I think the Iranians have so far, in response to the taking of the Iranian tanker, the reason why they took a British tanker in response is because they wanted to, first of all, prevent an escalation, because the Iranians believed that this was just the beginning, and the Americans had planned to, either through themselves or through other countries, take other Iranian tankers. So the Iranians thought that they should stop this process immediately by stopping this tanker. That's my understanding of the situation. So in a sense, they did it to prevent an escalation. But in addition to that, they're very focused on one particular tanker from Britain in response to an Iranian tanker, meant that Iran does not want to direct any difficulty towards other countries besides those that have been behaving antagonistically towards Iran. In fact, if you look at the region, Oman is close to Iran, Qatar is close to Iran, Kuwait, the only two countries that are showing hostility to Iran in the region are Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and Iran has repeatedly warned these two countries to end their cooperation with the United States in this economic war, as Trump calls it.
Let me go to you, Professor Begg, also about the UK. We remember dearly the word JCPOA. Now, it is a shame that we cannot mention it anymore because it's not a reality anymore. But with the UK ever more involved in this Iranian issue in such a way over the past few weeks, would it mean that the UK have been dragged into a situation in which the JCPOA could never become a reality anymore? Despite of the fact earlier that the European countries are very much pro to still protect the so-called Iranian nuclear deal?
Well, yes, I think the UK, in common with France and Germany, would like to preserve the JCPOA. But the reality of this is that the Trump administration has been very resolutely opposed to it and is using secondary sanctions as a tool to ensure that those parties to the agreement conform to the American view rather than the Iranian view or the European view. If you were the chief executive of a big European company trading with the US and also having some small amount of trade with Iran, and the Americans said to you, you can no longer trade with the US if you continue to trade with Iran, or we will sanction you. The power of the bully is very powerful there, and the reality of this is that the Europeans don't have an alternative way of dealing with this yet to go up against the American view. Iran, quite bluntly, is just too economically insignificant for the Europeans to be so concerned about.
Mr. Eland, it's not a secret that we have this kind of man-made tensions near the region of the Strait of Hormuz about the Iranian issue over decades. We heard about that decades earlier with officials coming from the Israeli defense ministry saying we're ready at any moment. Now, I don't want to drag into any more players in this already dramatic story, but that is one thing which I'm saying, Mr. Eland, which is drama is one thing. The real situation and the real story behind the surface is another thing. So to you, what is the real story?
Well, I think the real story did start with the U.S. abrogation of the Iran nuclear agreement, and very frankly, that was a bad move on Trump's part, because the only we produce more oil now than we used to, so we don't depend on the Persian Gulf, but we're still, quote unquote, defending this oil, and that goes through the Strait of Hormuz, which is probably not going to be closed down for the simple reason that our Iranian colleague has mentioned, that Iran uses it too. Now, that doesn't mean that they won't try to do a tit for tat on a tanker here or there, but they have no incentive to do that. So the only strategic issue that the U.S. should have with Iran is it getting a nuclear weapon. That could threaten the United States, because we don't. We need to let other people defend Persian Gulf oil. The Chinese can do it, or somebody else can do it, because we don't get that much oil from there. And also, we've got to cut costs, and so we really need to concentrate on the strategic reality, and that is the nuclear agreement. But of course, Trump has gone away from that to get all these other things on missiles or Iranian proxy forces to add to the agreement, and he could have built on the existing agreement. But because he has this thing where he wants to undo everything Obama did, that's the problem here.
Another problem, really big problem, Professor Beck. Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, likely to expire very soon, early next month. Now, Iranian nuclear issue will become a big one, even a bigger one by that time, which is only a week away. So what can we say about the latest situation? Are we facing a very different level of danger as we speak?
Well, I don't want to exaggerate it. There are dangers, but they are containable dangers. And the one thing that's intriguing about Trump is that he seems to be very, very wary of engaging in direct military action. Think of all the previous US presidents who've engaged in military action. Trump seems to shy away from that. So we can perhaps be reassured to that extent that he doesn't seem to want a conflict. Now, some of his advisors, like Bolton in the National Security Advisor role, I think are more a concern than Trump himself. So we should look beyond the nuclear deal to the broader geopolitics of what's going on. Quite clearly, the Trump administration thinks Iran is engaging in ventures in other parts of the Middle East. I'm not going to make a judgment of whether that's right or wrong, but they think that, and that's what's driving some of these pressures on the non-proliferation in other areas.
Right.
But I think that what we should concentrate on is how to de-escalate it.
how to de-escalate. That's exactly the issue, but nobody is talking about it, it seems, among the parties involved. Professor Morandi, do you think Iran can take the lead in that regard? Very briefly, you have a minute about Professor. Go ahead.
Well, if it's the tanker issue, I think that the Iranians would release the British tanker if the British released the Iranian tanker. So it's quite simple. The Iranians believe that this was piracy. They have to give it up, and that would probably lead to the end of the story. With regards to the nuclear deal, Iran continues to abide by the nuclear deal. It has reduced a couple of its commitments, but by and large, it is abiding by its commitments, especially with regards to international oversea, which is Iran is still fully abiding by the deal. So despite the fact that the United States is ratcheting up tensions, despite the fact that Trump has said repeatedly or spoken repeatedly about obliterating Iran, implying some sort of nuclear attack, which is just stating that is a crime, Iran has been very restrained in its behavior towards the United States and in the region.
All right. Professor Mohammad Morandi from Iran, Professor Ian Begg from the UK, and Mr. Ivan Eland coming from the US. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for sharing your thoughts on one platform with us. I think it takes more than this conversation, but certainly this is a good one to begin with. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. And tune in again next time, tomorrow, for more insights across China and around the world. Good night.